Hey, I'm Pep, and this is a Pep Talk. Now today, we're going to talk about trading card games and collectible card games and essentially how to get into them and maybe some things to avoid. So if you just started looking into Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic the Gathering or Pokemon, I'm sure there's a lot of other ones that I just can't think of. Either way, this video is for you. Now if you've played board games or video games before, there's going to be a big difference that you'll notice coming in very fast, and that is cost. See, the thing is, when you play a board game, with some exceptions, generally that game costs X amount. Let's say $50. Or a video game, let's say $80. Video games can be expensive. But you know what? Let's, benefit of the doubt here, say that you even happen to be playing something that has a little bit of purchasable content, maybe some downloadable content, maybe just an expansion that you'll buy down the road. Either way, let's double that price. Let's say for a board game, maybe you're now paying $100 instead, or for a video game, you're now paying $160. Whew, that's getting expensive. You have literally no idea. Now, I don't want to scare you away from playing something like Magic. And Magic is what I play the most now. I used to play a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! But I'm a little out of the time, so I can't really quote prices properly or anything. But with Magic, I'm a little bit more in tune. So if Magic happens to be the thing you're interested in getting into, congratulations, this will be great. But I think my advice will apply to a lot of other games as well. Now your first step is deciding, are you going to be playing, casually with your friends, or are you going to be trying to play competitively? It's like I'm making one of those little flowcharts. Well, if you happen to have chosen competitively, and you've never played before, then turn back around and change your mind and play casually. And no, I'm not saying that you should never play competitively. What I'm saying is, to play competitively costs usually a lot of money if your goal is to win, and I guess why are you trying to play competitively if you're not trying to win? I mean, you can still play casually and then go to an event and watch people decimate you. But let's just jump back to the playing casually, at least for a little bit. We might get back into some competitive stuff later. Now, even if you're playing casually, you have a couple options. Are you extremely casual, where you don't even really look up the rules and the formats and all that kind of thing? I mean, you know the rules of the game, but you don't look up like exactly what cards are banned or limited or anything like that, and you just play? Well, if that's you, that's great. Whatever cards you get your hand on, the better. If you do choose a format, you've got a couple different formats to look at. In a lot of these games, there's usually an older format that will allow a lot of older, ridiculously expensive in most cases, and ridiculously powerful cards. Whereas a newer format might allow a lot less of those kind of things. Now, some card games, like Yu-Gi-Oh! Has the approach where pretty much everything is usually accessible. There are some things that are limited or banned, and they do have an older format for that. But generally, most things can be used. There aren't a cycling format as it goes. Often these kind of games will have something called power creep, because if you have access to all of those things at all times, every new set that comes out has to have slightly more powerful things in it, or else why would you bother being interested in this set? Of course, they can also have just different things that are equally as powerful, but you'll notice the power creep. If you haven't played a game like Yu-Gi-Oh! For 10 years and you go and play now, you'll notice the power creep. And that's often true about things like Magic the Gathering as well. But the Magic the Gathering power creep is interesting because it started very high, kind of went lower, and then started going back up again. But the thing is, if you're playing standard Magic, you're basically only allowed to use the last few sets. I don't know exactly how it works right at this moment because we're not playing competitively. And I know they changed it recently, the number of sets back it goes. And there's also the modern format, where you play a lot more sets back. But you still don't use any of the crazy, overpowered, overexpensive cards from the past. Either way, you probably want to pick what format. And the easiest way to pick this format is figure out what your friends are doing. Because likely you're in one of two camps. Either you just started wanting to play and you don't have any friends who are playing, or you have friends who play and they're like, hey, come play this with us. There's a lot of A or B's I'm going through. I'm going to forget some. But let's start with the idea that you already have friends that are playing. In my opinion, this is the ideal place to start because you can start playing Magic the Gathering for free. Because most people who play a game like Magic or any card game have multiple decks. They have just a lot of different ideas set aside and they have multiple decks made so they can play with other people, and likely they'll be very willing to let you use their deck whenever you play. If you have a really generous friend and they have a fairly cheap deck, they might even just give you one. This is great because one of the most important things I think when getting into this kind of thing is figuring out if you like it, and if you do, what you like. What format you like, what type of cards you like, what type of scene you like. Do you like playing casually? Do you like a more competitive spirit? You get to figure that out without having to have a front-loaded cost. Now, on the other hand, if you start playing and don't have anyone else that plays, maybe you try to influence your friends into joining and playing with you. Now, this is where you need to be really careful, in my opinion. Ideally, what you want to do, and this is what I did and my group of friends did, is find some sort of a large collection of Magic that you can buy for a small price, or whatever card game you're interested in. In our case, we bought somebody's collection who was stopping playing. I believe they'd already sold off their more expensive cards, and it was essentially the leftovers, and we paid, between 5 of us, $50 for a fairly large, hefty box of cards. And because there's 5 colors in Magic, we essentially agreed, okay, each of us will pick a color and take that color. And there was some leftover stuff like some multicolored legends and artifacts and things like that. And so we made some decks and did a little tournament to see who would get the stuff. It was fun, it was interesting, and we all only paid $10 and got to make a couple of decks out of it. Heck, if you go into a store right now and buy like a pre-constructed deck, you're looking at, at least $15, $20 usually. So if you can pull something like this off, that's great. Otherwise, you probably want to look at these little pre-constructed decks. And you know what? If it were 10 years ago and you asked, should I buy one of these decks? I would say, no, that's a bad idea. Like they make those decks to sell products. They don't make them to sell competitive decks. But you know what? Nowadays, they actually do make usually pretty good things. Maybe less so if you're buying like a pre-constructed standard deck, but the pre-constructed commander decks, we'll talk about that in a second, are generally a great value. In a lot of cases, if you actually buy the deck and strip out 2 or 3 cards and sell those cards, you get back almost the entire cost of the deck. And usually those cards actually aren't good for you. They're very situational and they're expensive because they're good in a different format. And that is where I think the most important part of this pep talk is going to come in. See, all of these are full of decks. Here's some extra cards from when I played Yu-Gi-Oh! The thing is, you don't need this stuff to play. When I bought all of these, and these are like a quarter of my Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards that I still have for some reason. When I got into this, I was trying to collect things. I wanted to have one of everything. And you know what? If you can manage to get in at the ground floor of a game that's just started, awesome. If something comes out, you're really interested in it, you hear some buzz that it's really good, makes sense. Maybe you want to get into that kind of thing. And you could potentially collect everything. In fact, someday it might be worth a lot. If you happen to have collected Magic cards from the start, you would have a collection worth hundreds of thousands of dollars at this point if you had one of everything. Likely more. I'm sure there's seasoned Magic the Gathering players who are laughing when they hear $100,000. But the thing about something like this is that it requires a lot of upkeep, like just to keep up with that kind of thing. It requires a lot of money, and if your interest is in collecting things, sorry, this just isn't the right video for you. I'm not going to give you advice on how to collect things because you're just choosing to spend money at that point. And if you're doing it as an investment, that's one thing, but it probably makes more sense to invest in sealed product than it does to invest in trying to get one of everything. You're likely going to spend a lot of money up front. But if your goal is to just play the game, then, you're going to play the game. You're going to have a lot of decks. You're going to have fun with it. But the thing is, at the end of the day, you don't need to have every card. And on top of that, you don't need to have the most expensive cards. So in Magic the Gathering, one of the more popular formats is called Commander. Because normally you can put 4 copies of a card in your deck in like a standard game. And not only can this be expensive, because even new cards that come out, if they're very good in a deck, can often be $20, $30, maybe even $60 per card. And so, of course, assuming you want 4 copies, which a lot of times you do, you're basically saying, okay, I want to make this deck to play competitively. Well, here's $240. Now, it's not $240 so you can play Magic for a couple of years. It's $240 so you can have a deck, and not even a full deck, 4 cards in a deck that you play however long it takes until that deck rotates out or becomes a not very good deck because a lot of new things counter it, whatever. And will these cards hold their value? Maybe. It depends on whether or not they fit in a particular format. And that's getting into something that you probably don't want to get into. If you're playing the game to play and have fun, and even if you are playing to be competitive, you're likely not playing to like follow the value market of cards and figure out what legacy and vintage and modern formats that these cards find play in to figure out whether or not their costs will stay. That's not what you want, right? So again, I suggest just skipping out on competitive, at least at first. But again, let's say you're playing Commander, and so in Commander the difference is instead of having 4 of each card, you can only have 1 of every card. And you also have like a Commander that is a legend that's the face of your deck, and you can pop it in and out quite often during a game. But the thing is, the games are a bit slower, a bit more interesting. You can have a lot of things that come into play that normally might not make it in a game. So like if something were to cost 8 or 9 mana, you generally wouldn't get in. But the point I'm trying to make here is that when you have that kind of a format where you can only have 1 of each of things, it's usually a little cheaper, because you only have to buy 1 copy of something, and you can fill a lot of your deck out with things that are relatively cheap but actually have amazing effects that you just normally couldn't play in the other formats. Now, I wanted to give you an example, 2 examples. So here's a card, Wheel of Fortune, that costs something like $60. Now, I have this in one of my decks. Thing is, in that same deck, I also have 4 other cards that essentially do similar to the exact same things. 2 of these cost $5 each. $5 compared to $70. 2 other ones cost less than $1. Heck, you probably pick them up off someone for free because they're just generally not seen as good cards. But again, they do similar things. Now, to jump to the other example, we have Gauntlet of Might, which is like a $600 card. Now, this isn't me trying to brag. It's important to note that when I got this card, I got it for $40. I got it quite a long time ago, and I happened to want it for a deck. I happened to see that it was $40, and because I did follow the markets and stuff, I knew that the price was going to keep going up. Anyway, here are 4 other cards that do similar things and cost somewhere between $20 and $40 each. $600, $40. Now, for some, it probably seems obvious. Like, well, I'm getting into something for the first time. Of course, I'm not going to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on things. But it's not always that obvious to people. And on top of that, in the situation where, let's say you start trying to play and you get 3 of your friends into it, I have seen this happen to people before. Maybe the person who started it off had very, altruistic ideals. We're just going to play and have fun, and everyone will spend, like, let's say even if you all spend $50, it's like you're buying a game. You all spend $50 in making some decks and having fun and playing, and it's not a big deal. But then someone goes to make a red deck and thinks, oh, Gauntlet of Might is really good, I'm going to buy that and put it in my deck. Why? That's so much money. And it's so much money Just so you have an idea, what it does is it makes it so your mountains, your red mana, taps for 2 instead. Now, it's not just yours, it's everybody's. So, it costs 4 mana. Here is a card that literally does the exact same thing, except you can pick the color. It doesn't even have to be red. And it costs 1 more mana. So it costs 1 more mana, meaning you might get it out a turn later. And it costs like a 1/10 of the cost of the other one. And again, in theory, is better because you can pick the color. And that's the really tricky part. The cost of things isn't necessarily relevant to how good that card would be when you actually use it. So if you are trying to buy a deck, and you're trying to buy individual cards for the deck rather than, just buying some sort of a pre-made thing, which I highly suggest is buying something that's pre-made, then this is a pitfall you really have to be careful not to stumble into. Because usually you can find something that does a very, very similar thing at a fraction of the price. And while we're on that topic, if we're talking about price anyway, don't buy expensive things. I mean, if you have a lot of money and that's what you're doing, that's fine. But don't buy them for no reason. And maybe set yourself a limit. A lot of times, Magic and a lot of card games are like gambling. Because they are gambling, you're paying money sometimes to open sealed product and see what comes in them, and you can go down into a rabbit hole very fast. So the thing is, I think it's very important that you set some sort of a limit on yourself. And as a group of friends who are getting into it, it might be important that you set the limit for the group as well, so that one person, A, doesn't stumble down into a rabbit hole of obsession and spend not hundreds of thousands, but possibly tens of thousands of dollars, not just buying some expensive cards, but finding foil version of those expensive cards and getting specialty land that do nothing different but just look cool and cost $5 a piece instead of 5 cents a piece. There's so many scary places you can go. So setting a limit is a good way. Maybe you treat it as a form of entertainment and you say, okay, I'm not willing to spend more than $50 a month on Magic. Maybe $100 a month, whatever it is. So you set yourself a bit of a budget, so whenever you go to build something, you don't overblow it. And maybe instead of doing a monthly thing, you do kind of a per deck thing. Maybe every few months you make a new deck, and whenever you make a deck, you say, I've got something like $100 limit. Now when you set these limits, it's important to take note that you shouldn't probably be spending more than like a quarter of whatever your limit is on one card. It might be really cool, but unless it's your commander for the deck, then spending $25 on it is not likely going to give you as much benefit as you think. And though expensive cards tend to have good effects, it's not like you're directly going to win a game by having a more expensive deck than someone else. The color red is a good example. In Magic, red stuff tends to be relatively cheap, do damage fast, come in and hurt people quite quickly. And even in Standard, if you have the opportunity to make a red deck, I will often suggest that. Because a very cheap red deck, you could pay something like $20, which is incredibly low, and get into playing competitive Magic using red. I told you I was going to talk about Magic a lot. But the other thing that tends to be a bit of a trap, quote unquote, is accessories. Like with any other game, you're playing a video game or a board game, maybe you have certain accessories that you add, and those tend to up the price a little bit, but Magic can get a bit extreme. Whatever you're playing, maybe you need binders in order to hold whatever it is you're using. Maybe you need sleeved sheets in order to store your cards. Maybe you need sleeves for your decks. Maybe someone convinces you that you need to double sleeve your decks. Because you can get these like real tight, close-knit sleeves that also fit into other sleeves. And they make it so that your deck is very protected. And it makes sense because, as I said, some individual cards are worth $600. So it makes sense you want to protect that. Because one person spilling a drink on it could suddenly mean that $600 card is worth $50. which actually still sounds like a lot. But that's not all. Maybe you want to buy something to carry your cards in, so you buy a nice quiver. Maybe you want something cool to play on, so you buy a nice playmat. Please don't fall, cards. Thank you. Maybe you want to track your dice really nice. A life really nice with really nice dice, so you buy some dice that are beautiful thrice. Maybe you buy a custom life spinner so you can keep track of your life that way. Now, if you've been playing Magic for years, or you're like really into it, or again, any card game makes sense. You get accessories, you get real interested, you invest in it. But if you're starting for the first time, please don't do it. You don't need all these accessories. You can keep, like a lot of times you can buy what are called fat packs. I think there might be another term, but that's the term I'm used to, where it comes in one of these little boxes. And it's like 6 packs of cards, usually has a big pack of land in there. You get a dice. They used to come with actual books, like Magic the Gathering books, but they stopped doing that. Well, the point is, if you buy one of those and that's how you start your collection off, you have a nice little box that you can hold probably a couple decks in and some extra things. Yu-Gi-Oh! Was the same way. It came with little tins often that you could store things in. They didn't usually hold the cards as well because they weren't designed to hold the cards. They were kind of loose unless you jammed everything in. But the point is, it's very easy to find solutions for that kind of thing. Heck, when I first started, I'm pretty sure I kept my cards in a shoebox. And you really only need one set of dice. A couple of dice that can be used as the counters, and a couple of dice that can be used to keep track of your life. Now, I know I said no accessories, but I do suggest sleeving your cards. Whatever you decide to use as a deck should probably be in sleeves. One, because it means that your cards won't get damaged if you happen to actually get a couple of valuable cards early on, maybe by chance. And two, tends to make it easier to shuffle. It hides the backs of cards, so if some of your cards are a little older and more damaged, which they might be if you're starting for the first time, picking up someone's collection, then you wouldn't notice the difference between those cards and newer cards. But like with cards, sleeves come in varying price ranges. So for your first time, probably not a bad idea to just buy some cheap sleeves. Eventually you might get some more expensive ones. But the thing is, if you're going to keep replacing them anyway, cheap sleeves are probably okay. The price differences aren't usually that high though, so whatever works for you. But you know what? I've been talking a lot about the price of things and what to do and what not to do, and not really talking about how to really get into it yourself. And that's honestly pretty important. Now, with a lot of these kind of games, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Magic, whatever, they might have similar starting ideas. But again, I'm going to mostly reference Magic here. So what do you do when you want to make your first deck and you want to make something interesting to play with people? Well, we'll skip all the stuff I've already talked about price and making sure not to buy things that are too expensive. But what do you do? Well, again, we got 2 options. The creativity option, where you just kind of look at things and make decisions on your own and just build what seems fun and interesting to you. Or B, you use the internet and look at what other people have made. What is a good deck? Option 2 is often what gets people going down that rabbit hole I talked about. Because when you look at these things, you start looking through, and sure, some of the cards are probably cheap, a quarter, 50 cents, 10 cents, whatever. Every once in a while, though, you'll come to something that's like $20. And you look at the card and say, oh, I get why it's so expensive. This card looks amazing. But, again, if you're playing for the first time, unless that's literally part of whatever combo the deck needs in order to go off and do what it's doing, you can probably cut that. I do suggest looking online because it's a good way to start things and get ideas. And heck, what might happen is you start looking through one deck and you just see one card or a group of cards and you think, that's really cool, that's what I want to go with. And so you don't look at that deck, you just take those cards out, look at them separately, and maybe start looking up things that would work with them. So it gets your inspiration going. You don't have to start from nowhere. But what if you are sort of starting from nowhere, or even if you have looked it up? What kind of things do you want to do? Well, first of all, you probably don't want to go too many colors. And if you're thinking of other card games, too many factions, too many different directions. You usually want to have some sort of focus. What level of focus you have is up to you. If you want complete focus, like you want to just run a red deck that's goblins and just does a bunch of goblin stuff, it's probably going to work great. At least for, casual, fun environment. But if you wanted to do red-white and focus not only on damage, but a little bit on life gain and maybe on some enchantment removal, all that kind of stuff, you want to mix the two colors and find things that work well with them, good, that works too. That's probably about where you want to stop though. Especially for your first time, you don't likely want to go more than 2 colors. And I don't want to go super deep into what you want out of each color, but I'll do it for a few of them. If you're red, likely the chances are that you're going for aggression. You want fast creatures, things that come in with haste so they can attack right away, things that maybe have a bit higher on the power scale, maybe trample so they can get through, maybe just a bunch of things that come out really fast and just swarm your opponent. On top of that, you likely have spells that can do direct damage, or burn creatures that your opponents play so they're out of the way so your small things can get through. Red often wins really fast if they're going to win. Now on the other hand, you have something like blue, where can they be aggressive? Sure, but a lot of times what you're doing is trying to keep control of the game, often until you can get something bigger or just game-ending out. So you might have some counter spells and things that can slow your opponent down and stop them from playing some very detrimental things to you. All at the same time, maybe putting up a few defenses, but basically waiting until you have enough resources in order to, again, throw out something that's basically game-ending. A really big creature or a really big artifact or effect that just is hard to stop. Green, a lot of times, is a mix between the two things I just said. They'll often be able to throw a lot of things out very fast, but usually they'll kind of like to ramp their mana up and get access to a lot early so that they can play some big, scary thing that's just, again, really hard to stop. Unlike blue, you might not usually have a lot of ways to stop what your opponent's doing, so you kind of have to still try to outpace them, similar to how red does. Black is also kind of put towards control like blue is. Sometimes it can also overwhelm like red does, but a lot of times it has a bit of a control element. You're not usually going to be countering anything, but oftentimes you'll be destroying creatures as they come in. A lot of your creatures will also have effects that will help them destroy other creatures, or get bonus things whenever your creatures die or their creatures die. Most of the colors do kind of what it sounds like they would do. White, for example, is about purity. You often will be able to cleanse things, get rid of enchantments, get rid of artifacts, things that aren't natural. I don't know. White also usually has a good ability to swarm and get a lot of things out fast, but on top of that, they're very good at gaining life. And that's a very good counter often to red, because red will often burn itself out pretty fast trying to deal that damage. So if white can gain enough health that they get past that burn point, well, now you can start to overwhelm the red deck. And this is where mixing colors together will work. Something like red and blue will often make a good mix because you're able to be aggressive while actually being able to counter things that your opponents might use to try to stop you. Again, I don't want to get into all of them, but the point is you have a lot of options and it can be intimidating at first, but think of it this way. The purpose is to have fun, and that's what you want to do. You want to make a deck, you want to have fun with it, and you want to do that without spending a ton of money, at least at first. You will get into it more gradually if it's something that interests you, but just be careful about how hard it is on your wallet at first. And if you have friends that are playing as well, often you can just follow their lead. If your friends happen to be spending a lot of money on Magic, and you have the money you can also spend, then go along with them. If your friends, on the other hand, are a bit more conservative and just kind of usually play the same decks, maybe upgrade them fairly rarely, you probably want to stick to the same kind of thing. I mean, you might be able to have a local game night or something, or a friendly local game store where you can go and play with, the bigger, more powerful decks. But a lot of times you're going to be playing with your friends, so it's a good idea to not try to set a bar above where everyone else is, because you might actually get some people weaned off the game and just not interested anymore because they can't keep up. If you come in and you show off this deck that you paid $600 for, and their deck is worth a total of 30, and then you go and play and you just stomp over everybody, they're not going to feel good, and they're likely going to feel like they need to also spend $600 in order to be on your level, and maybe they don't want to. So that's just something to think about whenever you're getting into it for the first time. Think about how your friends are playing, think about the kind of spending habits they have, and try to stick to the same level. And if you notice somebody who's getting a little out there on spending, maybe try to wean them off a bit and say, do you really need to be spending this much? Talk to them about some of the things I mentioned, where some things that are expensive, you might be able to find cheaper versions, and the difference isn't really all that big in the end. Again, if you're playing casually. If you're going to be playing competitively, some of those things are probably pretty important. And when it comes to talking about price, the one last thing I want to say is that if you're trying to get into Magic and you hear a lot of people talking, and when people talk, they say something like, oh, I don't want to run a 5-color deck because the land base would be too expensive, and like this would be too expensive and all that. It can get you down a little bit thinking that, oh, these aren't options that I have. But you know what? That's just not correct. It's correct that having the optimal land base or having the optimal deck would be too expensive. But for almost everything in Magic, there's a cheaper alternative that usually isn't that much worse. You might be a turn behind everybody, but it's better to be a turn behind everybody and having fun and pay very little money than to pay almost 10 times the amount for some things just in order to be slightly faster. A lot of times when you're playing with big groups of friends and you're playing casually, the games are played, you kind of target whoever is in the lead, whoever has more power at that particular moment. So if your deck is just a turn slower, it just means that people probably aren't going to pick on you until a turn or two later. So it really shouldn't amount to all that much in the end. Anyway, that's been my pep talk. If you have any other questions or comments, put them in the comments below. And if you have any other suggestions for people who are trying to get into something like Magic or other collectible or trading card games, also put those in the comments below so other people can see them. Otherwise, thanks for watching. And until next time, live free, game hard.